Hello, my name is Emily Bernal, and I did my research paper on how a racialized Mexican migrant identity is formed, transmitted, and internalized, and how it affects social mobility and subjective well-being. I titled it Not a Language Barrier. My research paper explored how structural constraints in community reinforcement shape a racialized Mexican migrant identity that harms the subjective well-being, especially for temporary migrants. The significance of this research was to understand how subjective vulnerability can explain why migrants continue to struggle even after entering the US labor market or gaining more stability, which I think is a common misperception that people have. For example, in Mexico, people have this expectation that if you migrate, your life conditions should improve, but I don't think they're considering that the increase of income does not equal better life conditions. My purpose was to explain how a racialized Mexican immigrant identity forms, show how this identity persists even when structural barriers exist, demonstrate how this internalized identity harms subjective well-being by threatening cherished values, and especially to reframe migrant struggles as public issues and not as personal failings. My thesis statement was the structural issues in community reinforcement, marginalized and racialized and Mexican migrant identity that temporary migrants internalize. This internalized identity functions as a constraint itself by limiting their perceived opportunities, shaping their behaviors, and negatively affecting their subjective well-being. These are the research questions I go over in my paper. I explored how structural conditions create a racialized Mexican immigrant identity. How is this identity socially transmitted and internalized through community and symbolic interactions? Why does this identity persist even when policies change? How does internalizing this racialized identity leads to downward subjective well-being? And to conclude, I explore how can the sociological imagination reframe these struggles as structural issues rather than as personal shortcomings. My paper is in part a response to address a common misperception that the struggles that temporary migrants are facing is the result of personal shortcomings, such as a language barrier, or because they are uneducated, unskilled, but I aim to explain that the lack of social, economic, and civil rights that they are currently facing is the real cause of the constraint. To illustrate how structural issues act as the cause of these constraints, I explore how a great age of oppression implies many social inequalities, and this is because it's created by restricted policies. For example, the passage of IRCAN made it illegal to hire undocumented immigrants, and this led many employers to hire migrants without protections, with lower payment, and usually in very bad conditions. And this led to the and this result in a indirect classification of migrants as a racialized working class minority. And I think that this Mexican migrant identity has become racialized because by using symbolic interactionism, we can understand how symbols that are attributed to Mexican immigrants, such as being unskilled or illegal, or how their English proficiency may indicate if they are not intelligent, or how housing segregation, that is a result of a structural constraint, can be perceived as how Mexicans just live on poor neighborhoods. And this became symbols of lower class status that indicate that the outcomes of structural constraints are produced by racialized identity that we attribute by social meanings. And just to give an example of how we attribute symbols to the class of job you have, to class status, I want to use this image that I remember from class, in which I found interesting of how the job descriptions for the working poor class and the underclass are the job options that migrants usually only have access to. And in this image, they are, for example, lower paid factory workers, seasonal workers. But what is interesting is that in this image, they explain the reason because of they are unskilled. laborers. laborers. But as I explained before, the reason why migrants are restricted to this kind of jobs are more because of policy limitations rather than the lack of skills. But still, these relations are symbolic interpretations that we associate with the kind of work and the kind of skills or abilities that a person has.
Another important thing is how this identity becomes transmitted. It is usually through media representation. For example, in movies, there is a tendency to represent Mexican migrants with bad life conditions because of personal issues, and also by community transmission. For example, newcomers usually arrive with other migrants that haven't already been influenced by this racialized identity, and they become a level community mechanism of reinforcement among them, but also for the newcomers because they shape their behavior, they recommend the same jobs that they have known, and they also share their struggles and experiences of marginalization. And as a community, they end up internalizing each other's struggles and adopting this racialized identity. Something that I also found very interesting is that even when limiting policies change, the internalized identity will still act as a constraint in a community and in a personal level. For example, by using to voice double consciousness and the concept of the looking glass health, we can understand how the internalization of this perception that others have on you can impact the perception of yourself, that you have of yourself, and the opportunities and limitations that you think you have. And I think that Goffman explained this very well when he say that the things that, for example, Reggie thought a clean person should do were not things that Reggie himself did when he was in good standing with the authorities. And I think we can mirror this with the case of many migrants, since long before the increase of deportation and the passage of IRCA, social mobility has been already a challenge for many migrants. One of my main research questions was to show why internalizing this racialized identity leads to downward subjective well-being, and that question arises mostly because of this graph. I mostly focus on the group that experienced subjective downward mobility, which almost conforms a 40% of the migrant community, but also the privileged community. Even though their economic constraints reduce and their marginalization experiences reduce after immigration, they remain present in their lives. But in the case for the group for the subjective downward mobility, they didn't really experience economic constraints before migration, and after immigration, these economic constraints increase, and most significantly, their marginalization experiences arise after immigration. Here is the results overall for the group of migrants, and it mostly shows that even economic constraints reduce, the increase of marginalization was more significant. The increase of marginalization shows how an internalized racialized identity contradicts with maintaining migrants' personal values. For example, they may want to support their family, but at the same time, that means they cannot visit constantly them or they cannot spend enough time with them. They may also want to participate in activities they value, but at the same time, they feel unsafe when doing this. They want dignity as every human being, but they also need to accept degrading labor in order to achieve their goal of supporting their families. And this can show how the violation of their personal values and activities they may use to enjoy leads migrants to experience subjective downward mobility. This violation of their cherished values also leads into what Mills calls a time of crisis, indifference, and uneasiness, but it occurs in very different ways. For example, they experience a time of crisis due to the increase of militarization and policy restrictions, since they perceive this as a threat to their value of being able to support their family. For example, for those that have their families here in the US, being deported will significate a separation of their families, or if they have their families back in Mexico, this will indicate that they will not longer be able to accumulate savings to support their families economically. So this increase of policies are being perceived as a crisis on our current times. We are also experiencing a time of uneasiness, that is, when something is still wrong, but it cannot be clearly identified. And I explained that this problem is the racialized identity, since long before the increase of limiting policies, migrants have been struggling due to marginalization experiences. And lastly, I explained that we are experiencing a time of indifference, since migrants are not aware of certain values and that they are being threatened. For example, this occurs when we normalize the violation of values such as dignity as the normal migrant experience, and we don't. And this leads us to not perceive this as an issue, since we may believe that it was a personal decision to sacrifice everything. I conclude that the experiences of marginalization that lead many temporary Mexican migrants to experience downward social mobility and constrain them to the low working class are created by structural issues we reinforce and internalize by social creation of a racialized migrant identity. The internalization of this identity becomes a community and personal level mechanism that acts as a constraint even when structural issues are not fully present, and furthermore, it negatively affects their subjective well-being by normalizing the violation of their values. Some further implications is that even though policy changes are necessary, we also need to reconstruct socially how we perceive migrants' identity. And we can do this by increasing more realistic representations of Mexican migrants in media, not just how they are after they have been affected by structural issues. And we also need to remember that being migrant is just part of their identity, but they also have other significant values and activities and identities that are not really being recognized and valued as they should